2:17 a.m. The world was made of cold concrete and the smell of bleach. For Alara, this was not a new world, but it was a lonely one. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest on the pantry floor of 112 Orchard Lane, a house that was supposed to be a home but felt more like a waiting room with teeth. The single bare bulb overhead had been switched off from the outside, plunging her into a darkness thick with the ghosts of forgotten things. The earthy scent of old potatoes in a burlap sack, the sharp tang of vinegar from a tipped-over bottle, the faint, cloying sweetness of mouse poison tucked behind the shelves. She traced the grout lines in the floor with a small finger, a familiar map in an unfamiliar blackness. The crime, this time, had been a spilled glass of water. A single glass, knocked over by a tired elbow at the end of a long day. Mrs. Gable hadn't yelled. The quiet was always worse. The quiet was a promise of this. The click of the lock, a sound as final as a period at the end of a sentence. Through the thin wood of the door, Alara could hear the muted pulse of the television in the living room, the canned laughter of a sitcom. Life was continuing, just on the other side of the door, a universe away. She was 10 years old, but in moments like this, she felt ageless, a small, forgotten stone at the bottom of a deep well. Fear was a constant companion, a cold hand resting on her shoulder, but tonight it was joined by a profound sense of injustice that burned in her small chest. She had cleaned it up, every drop, but the spill was just the excuse. The reason was something deeper, something in Mrs. Gable's eyes that Alara couldn't name but felt in her bones. A brittle emptiness that needed to be filled by the smallness of others. She pressed her ear against the cool wood, listening past the television, past the hum of the refrigerator. And then she heard it, a low, distant rumble. So faint it was more a vibration in her teeth than a sound in her ears. It was the sound of a motorcycle engine, or maybe many, traveling along the distant highway. The sound had an odd familiarity, a resonance that plucked a string of a memory from a few weeks ago, a memory of sunlight and fear and a choice, a moment when she had not been a victim, but a helper. The rumble grew for a moment and then faded, leaving only the drone of the house and the frantic beat of her own heart. She closed her eyes, holding onto the fading vibration as if it were a promise. In the suffocating dark of the pantry, the memory of that sound was a pinprick of light, a reminder that another world existed, a world of open roads and powerful engines, a world where people didn't just disappear behind locked doors. She didn't know why it comforted her, but it did. It was a sound that belonged to someone else, somewhere else, and for a moment, it made her feel a little less alone. The next morning, the lock clicked open at precisely 7 a.m. Mrs. Gable stood there, her face a mask of neutral politeness, as if nothing had happened. Time for school, Alara. Your monthly review is today. Mr. Henderson is coming at 4. See that you're presentable. The words were clipped, sterile. The pantry door was left open, an invitation back into a world that had forgotten her for the night. The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. At 4:05 p.m., the doorbell chimed. Mr. Henderson sat on the floral sofa, a worn briefcase on his lap, a tired smile on his face. He was a man drowning in paperwork, his empathy eroded by 1,000 similar visits to 1,000 similar houses. He saw a clean living room, a plate of store-bought cookies on the coffee table, and a foster mother, Mrs. Gable, radiating civic concern. He saw what he was meant to see. "So, Alara," he began, his voice attempting a warmth it couldn't quite achieve. "How are things? Settling in well?" Alara sat stiffly in the armchair opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel Mrs. Gable's eyes on her, a weight as real as a physical touch. "It's fine," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "Just fine," Mr. Henderson prompted, ticking a box on his form. "School is good? Mrs. Gable is treating you well?" This was the moment, the open door, the chance. The words caught in her throat, a knot of fear and desperation. She glanced at the pantry, hidden from view down the hall. "Sometimes," she began, her voice trembling, "sometimes when I do something wrong, she puts me in the pantry, The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Gable let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "Oh, Alara, don't be so dramatic," she turned to Mr. Henderson. Her expression a careful blend of maternal frustration and loving patience. "She has a tendency to embellish. She spilled a full pitcher of juice on the new rug last night during a tantrum. I had her sit in the pantry for 10 minutes to cool off while I cleaned the mess. A timeout. It's a standard disciplinary technique. As I'm sure you know." Mr. Henderson's gaze shifted from Alara's pale, earnest face to Mrs. Gable's plausible, concerned one. He saw a difficult, traumatized child and an overwhelmed but capable caregiver. It was the easiest narrative. It was the narrative that required the least amount of paperwork. "A timeout," he repeated, nodding slowly, already accepting it. "Yes, of course. Consistency is key." He looked back at Alara, his professional smile firmly back in place. "It's important to listen to your foster parents, Alara. They're trying to help you." He ticked another box. The conversation was over. The system, in the form of this tired, overworked man, had looked straight at her pain and deemed it an acceptable loss. As he gathered his papers, his gaze swept the room. "Everything looks in order here," he declared. The 5 most devastating words Alara had ever heard. They were a judgment, a closing of the case, a final click of a lock far heavier than the one on the pantry door. He left, and the silence he left behind was filled with Mrs. Gable's triumphant stillness. The system had not failed. It had worked exactly as designed. The rumble of the engine that Alara remembered in the dark had a source, a beginning on a sun-drenched afternoon 3 weeks prior. She was walking the long way home from the library, her worn canvas bag heavy with books. A copy of The Little Prince, its spine held together with tape, was tucked under her arm. As she passed the small city park, she saw him. A man, mountain-sized and clad in black leather, was slumped against a gleaming chrome motorcycle. His face, framed by a thick, graying beard, was pale and beaded with sweat. His breaths were ragged, shallow gasps. People on the sidewalk gave him a wide berth, their gazes sliding away, assuming he was drunk or dangerous. They saw the leather vest, the patches, the tattoos snaking up his arms. They saw a stereotype, not a man in distress. Alara saw only that he was hurting. Fear told her to run, to hurry home before Mrs. Gable could notice she was late. But a deeper instinct, a quiet, stubborn compassion that the world had not yet managed to extinguish, held her in place. She remembered a video from a health class. Check for responsiveness. Call for help. Start compressions. She crept closer. "Sir?" she said, her voice small. "Are you okay?" There was no answer, only a low groan. His eyes were closed. His hand was clutching the front of his vest, right over a patch that depicted a stylized iron raven. She saw his phone lying on the grass beside him. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, swiped the screen, and tapped the emergency call button. "I need an ambulance," she told the dispatcher, her voice surprisingly steady. "At the city park on Elm Street. A man has collapsed. I think it's his heart." The woman on the line was calm, professional. She asked if the man was breathing. Alara leaned close, feeling the faint, stuttering puff of air against her cheek. "Barely," she whispered. She said to start chest compressions. Put the phone on speaker for the next 7 minutes, which felt like a lifetime. Alara knelt beside the giant, her small hands laced together on his sternum, pushing down in a steady rhythm as the dispatcher counted with her. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Her arms ached, her body trembled with exertion and fear, but she didn't stop. She focused on the raven on his vest, a fierce, protective-looking bird. She pushed for the raven. When the sirens finally screamed closer, she scrambled back, fading into the shadow of a large oak tree as the paramedics swarmed the scene. She heard them use words like massive coronary and lucky someone was here. She saw them load him onto a gurney. Before they closed the ambulance doors, she heard one of them read the name stitched above the raven patch on his vest. Forge. The name sounded strong, like the man himself. As the ambulance pulled away, leaving a sudden, Ringing silence, Elara noticed one of his motorcycle saddlebags was unlatched. Acting on an impulse she didn't understand, she walked over, slipped her treasured copy of The Little Prince inside, and gently closed the clasp. It felt like leaving a piece of herself with him, a quiet offering of hope. Then, she turned and ran, the books in her bag thumping against her back, disappearing into the anonymous city streets. She was just a girl who didn't want to be late. A girl who had no idea she had just saved the president of the Iron Ravens Motorcycle Club and, in doing so, had lit a fuse. The weeks after Mr. Henderson's visit were a slow, grinding descent. The illusion of normalcy was gone, replaced by Mrs. Gable's unchecked authority. The pantry became a regular punishment, the reasons for it growing more flimsy and cruel. A dish not dried to her satisfaction. A moment of eye contact held too long. A question she deemed impertinent. The cold concrete became a familiar geography to Elara. She learned to dissociate, to travel inside her own head to the worlds inside her library books, places where courage was rewarded and kindness was a shield. But the escape was temporary. The hunger pangs from a missed dinner were real. The chill that seeped into her bones was real. The fear was always real. A quiet rebellion began to bloom in the darkness. She found a small, nub-like pencil and a tiny, spiral-bound notebook that had fallen behind a dresser. Under a loose floorboard in her room, hidden beneath a layer of dust and forgotten things, she began to document. Her entries were simple, factual, devoid of emotion. October 12th. Pantry, 8 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Reason: I sneezed while she was watching her program. Dinner withheld. October 15th. Pantry, 9 p.m. until morning. Reason: I didn't finish my homework fast enough. The small book became her anchor, a testament that these things were happening, that she was not imagining the cruelty. It was proof, even if only for herself. Her sense of isolation deepened. She tried once, from the payphone at the library, to call the child services hotline number she had memorized from a poster. She fed the coins into the slot, her heart pounding. An automated voice answered, presenting a labyrinth of numbered options. Press 1 for new placements. Press 2 for reporting a non-emergency. Press 3 for... Fear and confusion overwhelmed her. She imagined the call being traced, Mrs. Gable finding out. Her hand, slick with sweat, fumbled the receiver, and she slammed it back into the cradle, her coins clattering uselessly into the return slot. The system that was supposed to protect her was an impenetrable fortress of bureaucracy. Then Leo arrived. He was 6, with eyes too big for his face and a silence that spoke of a history much like her own. Mrs. Gable had welcomed him with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. The first time she saw Mrs. Gable grab Leo's arm, her fingers digging into his thin bicep for dropping a crayon, something inside Elara shifted. Her fear, once a purely selfish thing concerned with her own survival, expanded. It now encompassed this small boy who looked at her with a silent plea. The stakes had been raised. One night, she found him crying silently in his bed. She crept over and sat beside him. "She put me in the closet," he whispered, his small body trembling. It was dark. Elara didn't have words of comfort that felt true. Instead, she slipped her hand into his. She was not just a victim anymore. She was a witness. She was a protector. She added a new entry to her journal, her pencil pressing hard into the paper. October 29th. Leo, age 6. Closet, 4:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Reason: dropped a crayon. Her own fear was a familiar weight, but this new fear, the fear for him, was a sharp, unbearable blade. Something had to change. She just didn't know how. Arthur Forge Kellerman woke up in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and lilies from a well-meaning nurse. The first thing he felt was a profound, aching gratitude for the simple act of breathing. The second was a dull, throbbing pain in his chest, a physical reminder of how close he had come to the edge. The doctors called it a miracle, a widowmaker heart attack, out in the open. They said the immediate CPR, however amateurish, had kept his brain supplied with oxygen, buying them the precious minutes they needed. Whoever started compressions, the doctor told him, his face serious. They saved your life. No question, but no one knew who it was. The paramedics had arrived to find a ghost, a scene with no Samaritan in sight. For 2 weeks, Forge recovered, his mind churning on this single, frustrating point. The Iron Ravens lived by a strict, unwritten code. Debts were paid. Favors were returned. A life debt was the most sacred obligation of all. It was a bond forged in fire, and the anonymity of his savior was an unbearable weight. When he was finally discharged, his second-in-command, a quiet man called Silent Mike, brought him his bike from the impound lot. As Forge checked over his machine, his hands moving with practiced familiarity, he opened a saddlebag. Tucked inside, nestled against a spare set of gloves, was a small, battered paperback. The Little Prince. He picked it up, the cover soft and worn from countless readings. It was the only clue he had. A child's book. His savior was a child. The thought settled in his chest with a strange, fierce protectiveness. A kid had been brave enough to help him when a dozen adults had walked past. A kid had saved his life and then vanished. This was no longer just about paying a debt. It was about finding and protecting the source of such quiet courage. He brought the book to the next club meeting. The Iron Ravens were not the thugs people assumed them to be. They were veterans, mechanics, small business owners, men bound by loyalty and a shared disillusionment with a world that often looked away. They were a family. He held up the book. "Someone saved my life," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. "It was a kid. This is all they left. We're going to find them." The mission was adopted with solemn, unanimous consent. The search was methodical and discreet. They started at the park, talking to vendors and regulars. No one remembered seeing anything. They checked with local schools. Nothing. The city was a big place, and a quiet child was an easy thing to lose. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Wrench, the club's best mechanic, mentioned offhandedly that his niece volunteered at the main library, just a few blocks from the park. It was a long shot, but it was something. Forge went himself, the book in his hand. He found the head librarian, a woman named Ms. Albright with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He explained the situation, his voice stripped of its usual command, leaving only a raw, humble gratitude. He showed her the book. Ms. Albright's eyes softened as she looked at the worn-out copy. "I know this book," she said, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "There's a little girl, Alara. She checks it out every few weeks. It's her favorite." She hesitated, a professional reluctance to breach a child's privacy warring with a clear sense of concern. "She's a foster kid," she added, her voice dropping. "A quiet, sweet girl. Comes here to do her homework. Stays until we close." Forge felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Foster kid. A child already in the grip of a faceless system. "Do you know where she lives?" he asked. Ms. Albright shook her head. "I can't give you an address, but I know her social worker's last name is Henderson, and I've heard her mention Orchard Lane." It was enough. That evening, Forge made a call to a man the club kept on retainer, a retired detective with a knack for navigating databases. "I have a name and a social worker," Forge said into the phone. "Alara Henderson. Find her." The search was no longer just about gratitude. It was about a premonition, a cold, creeping certainty that the brave little girl who had saved his life might now need saving herself. The information from the private investigator came back within 48 hours, and it was worse than Forge had imagined. The file was thin on official reprimands but thick with red flags. 2 previous foster children had been removed from the care of Eleanor Gable on Orchard Lane after allegations of neglect. Both times, the cases were investigated by the same caseworker, Martin Henderson. Both times, they were closed, marked unfounded. The system had a paper trail of its own failures. Forge read the report twice, a cold, controlled fury building inside him. He saw the pattern, the bureaucratic inertia, the way a child's voice could be systematically erased by a caregiver's plausible denial and a caseworker's indifference. He saw Alara, the quiet girl from the library, trapped inside that pattern. The Iron Raven's motto, Stitched onto the back of every leather vest was no scutum nostri, we shield our own. By saving his life, Elara had unknowingly placed herself under the protection of that shield. The time for quiet investigation was over. It was time to mobilize. The call went out not as a roar, but as a series of quiet, discreet messages. Text chains, brief phone calls. The language was coded but clear. Church meeting. Tuesday, 17:30. Formal dress meant full colors, clean bikes, and a public-facing, disciplined presence. No hot-dogging, no aggression, just presence. A weight of numbers that could not be ignored. Tuesday, 4:30 p.m. Forge stood in his garage, the scent of gasoline and old leather hanging in the air. He made the final call, this one to Sarah Jenkins, a tenacious local reporter who had once done a fair story on the club's annual charity run. He kept his voice anonymous, a low, gravelly tone. "Be at 112 Orchard Lane at 5:30 this evening," he said. "A group of concerned citizens is planning to file a public records request regarding the foster placement at that address. They're filing it in person. You might find it newsworthy." He hung up before she could ask questions. He knew her journalistic instincts would do the rest. The mobilization began. Across the county, engines coughed to life. Not with the rebellious snarl of movie cliches, but with the synchronized, powerful thrum of well-maintained machines. 42 Harley-Davidsons, their chrome polished to a mirror shine, pulled out of driveways and garages. 42 men and women zipped up heavy leather jackets, their faces set with a grim, shared purpose. They converged not on the target address, but on a staging area 2 miles away, the parking lot of a closed-down supermarket. The formation was precise, military in its execution. They formed a column of twos, engines idling in a low, collective growl that seemed to make the very air vibrate. At 5:20 p.m., Forge pulled to the front. He looked back at the sea of determined faces. He didn't need to give a speech. They all knew the stakes. They all understood the code. He raised a single, gloved hand. 42 throttles responded as one. The procession pulled onto the main road, a river of dark steel and quiet resolve, flowing toward the manicured lawns and deceptive tranquility of Orchard Lane. The head count was exact. 42 riders, 1 reporter and her cameraman now racing to the scene, and 1 small girl who had no idea that the cavalry was coming. At 5:29 p.m., Orchard Lane was the picture of suburban serenity. Lawns were neatly edged, sprinklers whispered secrets to the twilight grass, and the scent of grilled chicken drifted from a nearby backyard. It was a street built on the illusion of safety, of order. At 5:30 p.m., the illusion shattered. The sound began as a faint, deep hum, a vibration felt in the soles of shoes before it was registered by the ear. It grew exponentially, not into a chaotic roar, but into a powerful, unified crescendo, the sound of a controlled avalanche. And then they arrived. The Iron Ravens flowed onto Orchard Lane from both ends, a perfectly synchronized maneuver. They didn't tear up the asphalt or rev their engines. They moved with a quiet, intimidating grace, parking their massive machines in a legal, orderly fashion along the curbs on both sides of the street. The column stretched the entire length of the block, a silent, black and chrome honor guard. Then, as if orchestrated by a single, invisible hand, 42 engines cut out at the exact same moment. The resulting silence was more profound, more deafening, than the sound had been. It was a vacuum, drawing the attention of everyone on the street. Faces appeared in windows. A man watering his petunias froze, the hose dangling from his hand. This was not a raid. It was an arrival. Forge swung his leg off his bike, his boots making a solid, deliberate sound on the pavement. Flanked by Silent Mike and another sergeant-at-arms named Bear, he began the long walk up the driveway of 112 Orchard Lane. They moved without haste, their heavy leather vests absorbing the last rays of the setting sun. Behind them, the other 40 members of the club dismounted, standing silently beside their bikes, arms crossed, their gazes fixed on the pristine white door of the house. They formed a silent, unbreachable perimeter of witness. Sarah Jenkins and her cameraman were already there, positioned on the public sidewalk across the street. The camera's red recording light a single, blinking eye in the twilight. The scene was cinematic, surreal. A quiet suburban street, held in a state of suspended animation by a force that was both perfectly lawful and deeply menacing. Forge reached the front porch. He didn't pound on the door. He pressed the small, illuminated doorbell. The cheerful, two-note chime was a surreal counterpoint to the tension gripping the street. A moment later, the door opened. Mrs. Gable stood there, a practiced, welcoming smile on her face, expecting a package or a neighbor. The smile dissolved as she took in the three large men on her porch, and beyond them, the silent army that had occupied her entire world. Her face, for the first time since Alara had known her, showed a flicker of genuine, uncontrolled fear. "Mrs. Eleanor Gable?" Forge's voice was not loud, but it carried in the heavy silence. It was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of negotiation. Mrs. Gable clutched the collar of her cardigan, her eyes darting past him to the legion of bikers and the news camera. "Who are you? What is this? You're trespassing. We're on your porch, ma'am." "That's all," Forge corrected gently. "We're here on behalf of Alara. We have some concerns about her welfare we'd like to discuss at that moment." A county-issued sedan pulled up hastily behind the line of bikes. Mr. Henderson got out, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. He had been called by a panicked Mrs. Gable just moments before, and had also received a pointed, official-sounding inquiry from Sarah Jenkins's news station about the home's complaint history. He saw the bikers, the camera, and his professional composure evaporated, replaced by the cornered look of a man whose carefully curated indifference was about to be publicly dismantled. He scurried up the walkway. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, directing his question at Forge but avoiding his eyes. "This is an inappropriate spectacle." Forge didn't even turn to look at him. He held up a thick manila folder. "This is a copy of a report compiled by a licensed private investigator," he said, his voice level. "It details the cases of 2 previous children removed from this home. It also details how both investigations were closed as unfounded by you, Mr. Henderson. We also have sworn affidavits from both of those children, who are now adults, detailing the abuse they suffered here." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "We were just about to file a formal request for all public records associated with this address and your case management of it." Inside the house, drawn by the voices, Alara crept to the doorway. She saw the huge man from the park. Forge. She saw the raven on his vest. Her heart, which had been a cold, tight knot of fear, gave a painful lurch of something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Sarah Jenkins, sensing a critical moment, crossed the street, her microphone extended. "Mr. Henderson, can you comment on the allegations that you repeatedly ignored signs of child endangerment at this residence?" Henderson's face went from pale to ashen. "No comment. This is a private matter concerning a minor," but it was no longer a private matter. 42 silent witnesses and a rolling camera had made sure of that. Mrs. Gable found her voice, a shrill, piercing shriek of indignation. "This is harassment. I am a respected foster parent. This girl is a liar. She's a troubled, manipulative child." Alara shrank back from the doorway, the familiar sting of the accusation cutting deep. But then she saw Forge's eyes find hers. He didn't smile, but his gaze was steady, a silent affirmation. It was all the courage she needed. With a surge of adrenaline, she turned and ran to her room. She pulled up the loose floorboard, her fingers finding the small, hidden notebook. It was her truth. It was her proof. She ran back to the doorway, past the sputtering Mrs. Gable, and straight to the reporter. She held out the notebook. "Here," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "This is what happens." Just then, the front door opened wider, and little Leo, drawn by the commotion, stepped out. He saw the angry faces, the camera, the big men. He did what any small, scared child would do. He pointed. He pointed a small, trembling finger at the pantry door, visible down the hall. "She puts us in there," he said, his voice small but carrying with the devastating clarity of a child's truth. When it's dark, the masks were gone. The carefully constructed reality of 112 Orchard Lane had been shattered by a notebook and a pointed finger. The arrival of a police cruiser a few minutes later felt less like an intervention and more like a formality. A nervous neighbor, seeing the silent army of bikers, had finally made the call. A veteran sergeant, a man named Miller with tired but perceptive eyes, stepped out of his car. He took in the scene not as a threat, but as a problem to be solved. He saw the news crew, the silent and disciplined bikers, the pale-faced social worker, and the hysterical homeowner. His experience told him this was not a simple disturbance call. Sergeant Miller approached Sarah Jenkins first, who quickly explained the situation and handed him Ilara's journal. He took it, his expression unreadable, and began to read. He flipped through the small pages, his eyes scanning the neat, childish script cataloging a litany of quiet horrors. The silence on the street stretched, thick and expectant. Everyone watched him. He closed the notebook, his jaw tight. He walked over to Ilara, crouching down to her level, his voice gentle. "Did you write this, sweetheart?" Ilara nodded, her eyes wide. He then looked at Forge, who had not moved from his spot on the porch. The two men, one in blue, one in black leather, shared a look of understanding that transcended uniforms. Forge gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all Miller needed. He stood up, his professional authority settling over him like a cloak. He turned to Mr. Henderson. "Sir, your supervisor has been contacted. We're going to need you to come down to the station to give a full statement regarding your handling of this case." He then faced Mrs. Gable, his voice losing its gentle edge. "Ma'am, for the safety of the children, no one is to enter or leave this house. We are securing it as a potential crime scene pending a warrant from Child Protective Services. A new caseworker is on their way to take custody of Ilara and Leo." Mrs. Gable began to protest, but the words died in her throat under the sergeant's unblinking stare. The transfer of power was absolute, public, and undeniable. The new caseworker, a woman with a kind but weary face, arrived 20 minutes later. She spoke to Ilara and Leo in soft, reassuring tones. As she prepared to lead them to her car, Ilara hesitated. She looked at Forge. He walked down from the porch and knelt in front of her, just as the sergeant had. He reached up and carefully removed the embroidered president patch from his own vest. It was the symbol of his authority, his identity. He pressed it into her small hand. The patch was thick and stiff, the image of the raven intricately stitched. "Nos scutum nostrae," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We shield our own. That includes you now, little bird." "It always will." Ilara closed her fingers around it. The sharp edges of the patch digging into her palm. Felt like a promise. Felt like an anchor. As the caseworker's car pulled away from the curb, Ilara looked out the back window. The iron ravens were still there, a silent, unmoving testament. They remained until her car was out of sight, a quiet promise that they were not leaving, that their watch had only just begun. The streetlights of Orchard Lane flickered on, illuminating an empty porch and a house that was no longer a home, but an exhibit in a case that was now wide open. 1 year later, the ripples of that evening on Orchard Lane had become waves of systemic change. The news story, spearheaded by Sarah Jenkins's relentless reporting, had exploded. The image of the silent bikers standing vigil, contrasted with the damning, handwritten entries of Ilara's journal, created a public outcry that officials could not ignore. Eleanor Gable was convicted on multiple counts of child endangerment and abuse, her carefully constructed facade dismantled in a courtroom by the calm, factual testimony of children she had tried to silence. Martin Henderson was fired, stripped of his license, and faced criminal charges for negligence and obstruction. His career a testament to the corrosive power of indifference. His case triggered a full, state-level investigation into the regional foster care system, unearthing years of buried complaints and systemic failures. In the state capital, a new piece of legislation was passed. They called it Ilara's Law. It established a fully funded, independent ombudsman's office for children in the foster system, a safe and confidential channel for reporting abuse that bypassed the traditional chain of command. It mandated smaller caseloads for social workers and implemented a three-strikes policy for homes with repeated, even if unsubstantiated, complaints. The Iron Ravens, once viewed with suspicion by the community, were now seen in a different light. They had shown their true colors not as outlaws but as guardians. Forge, guided by a new sense of purpose, used the club's resources to establish a non-profit foundation called the Raven's Nest. Its mission was to provide pro bono legal aid, educational grants, and mentorship programs for children navigating the complexities of the foster system. Their logo was a powerful black raven sheltering a single, small star, a quiet homage to a little prince and the girl who loved his story. The legacy was not just in laws and foundations. It was in the small, quiet life of a girl who was finally allowed to be a child. Alara had been placed in the care of Ms. Albright, the librarian, who had immediately applied to be her foster parent that very night. Leo, too, had found a new, loving home with a family just a few towns over. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Alara was at a park. Not the one where she had saved a life, but a new one, full of laughter and the squeak of swings. The Raven's Nest was hosting its first annual picnic. She was no longer the pale, silent girl who hid in the library stacks. Her laughter was loud and free as she threw a bright red ball for a golden retriever. Across the lawn, Forge sat at a picnic table, watching her. He was no longer just a club president. He was a guardian, a mentor, an uncle. He and the other Ravens were a constant, steady presence in her life, attending parent-teacher conferences, helping with homework, teaching her how to change the oil in Ms. Albright's car. They were her loud, unconventional, fiercely protective family. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Alara ran over to him, her face flushed with happiness. "Watch this," she yelled, throwing the ball farther than she ever had before. Forge smiled, a genuine, deep smile that reached his eyes. He heard the distant rumble of a motorcycle pulling into the parking lot, one of the other members arriving late. To most, it was just noise. But to Alara and now to him it was the sound of safety. It was the sound of the shield. It was the sound of home.